Picture the most expensive machine you can imagine. Now put it in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by nothing, costing you money every single second, whether it drills a single barrel of oil or not. That's an oil rig. And here's the part almost nobody outside the industry understands. Owning one has almost nothing to do with drilling, and almost everything to do with something most people never think about: contracts, geopolitics, and a countdown clock most owners are terrified of. A rig can sit perfectly idle, fully staffed, fully maintained, and burn through tens of thousands of dollars a day without producing a single drop of oil. So why would anyone own one of these things? Why do national governments, oil majors, and private billionaires all fight over access to floating steel platforms that can bankrupt you just for existing? Let's break down the real economics of owning an oil rig, because this is where global energy, geopolitics, and brutal financial risk collide in one machine. Let's start by correcting the most common misunderstanding about this entire industry. The rig itself is not really what you're buying. What actually matters is the contract stream attached to it. In offshore drilling, a rig is often best understood as a day-rate cash machine, and it only really functions as an asset while a client is actively paying for it. Take away the contract, and you're not left with an income-generating business. You're left with an enormous, extremely expensive piece of steel floating in open water. This is the first thing that separates oil rig economics from almost any other business you've thought about on this channel. You're not really buying a machine. You're buying the right to a payment stream, and that right disappears the moment the contract does. Here's the fact that should genuinely unsettle you if you're thinking about this as an investment. A rig can burn serious money even while sitting completely idle. Crews, maintenance, safety inspections, and operational readiness all continue costing money whether the rig is drilling or not. The economics of an idle rig flip from earning asset to storage problem far faster than most owners expect going in. You're not just failing to make money when a rig sits idle, you're actively losing it on a machine that looks, from the outside, exactly the same whether it's making you rich or slowly bleeding you dry. Here's where this stops being a story about machinery and becomes a story about geopolitics. Day rates, the price a rig can charge per day of work, function almost like a voting system on the state of the global oil market. That income depends heavily on offshore drilling demand, which itself depends on oil prices, geopolitical stability, and long-cycle capital spending decisions made by oil majors and national oil companies years in advance. In other words, the rig's income isn't really a bet on drilling. It's a second-order bet on the entire global energy cycle, and this cycle is shaped directly by geopolitics, sanctions, OPEC production decisions, war risk, shipping disruptions, and national energy policy can all swing demand for offshore drilling dramatically. A rig sitting in international waters can have its entire economic future altered by a decision made in a government building thousands of miles away. This is precisely why an oil rig belongs in a channel about macroeconomics and geopolitics. It's one of the purest physical expressions of how global politics converts directly into a single asset's bottom line. Offshore drilling is one of the most brutally cyclical industries on Earth, and understanding why explains almost every headline you've seen about the oil industry going bust right before it suddenly booms again. The best years in this business often arrive only after long stretches of pain, years of weak utilization, depressed day rates, and painful restructuring before the market finally tightens again. This is exactly why the industry can look completely broken right before it becomes lucrative again. This mismatched timing isn't a coincidence, it's structural. Oil prices can move within days. New rigs take years to build, contract, and mobilize into position. That gap between how fast oil prices swing and how slowly rig supply can respond makes this industry almost designed for boom-bust overinvestment. Everyone rushes to build rigs when prices are high. The rigs arrive years later, just as the cycle turns, and the market gets flooded exactly when demand is falling. When the market turns bad, owners have an option that sounds simple: cold stacking, essentially mothballing the rig, powering it down, minimizing costs until conditions improve. Here's the catch almost nobody accounts for going in. Cold stacking is not a pause button. It might save money in the short term, but reactivating a cold-stacked rig later can be extraordinarily expensive. Inspections, repairs, recertification, recrewing. That reactivation bill can erase a huge chunk of the upside an owner was hoping to capture by waiting out the downturn in the first place. You don't get to freeze time on a multi-hundred-million-dollar asset for free. The ocean, the steel, and the regulations don't wait for you. They keep degrading and evolving while your rig sits still. Here's a trap that's caught more than a few experienced buyers. Bankruptcy auctions and distressed rig sales can look like incredible bargains. They often aren't. The hidden costs of repairs, compliance updates, reactivation, and financing can quietly make the cheap asset the most expensive one in an entire fleet. You didn't just buy a rig at a discount. You may have bought years of deferred maintenance and compliance debt that the previous owner simply stopped paying for. In an industry this capital-intensive, the sticker price is almost never the real price. Here's a liability that sits quietly on the balance sheet, largely invisible until it isn't. Decommissioning. The end of a rig's operational life is not free. Removing the structure, environmental cleanup, and legal obligations tied to that process can create liabilities large enough to matter long before the asset even stops producing. Owners aren't just financing the rig's working life, they're implicitly financing its eventual, expensive death. This is one of the most overlooked numbers in the entire industry because it doesn't show up as a dramatic headline. It shows up decades later as an obligation that was quietly accumulating the entire time the rig looked profitable. Here's the risk that towers over every other number in this video: catastrophic accident risk. A major offshore accident can instantly overwhelm years of accumulated operating profit. These disasters are rare, but when they happen, the legal, environmental, and reputational costs can be enormous, easily dwarfing anything the rig earned in its best years. And here's the uncomfortable truth about protection against this: insurance does not make the risk disappear. It helps, but it doesn't fully neutralize catastrophic exposure, especially when claims get complicated, coverage limits are reached, or liability spreads across many different parties involved in a single operation. Owners still carry a large tail risk that no policy fully removes. This is the part of oil rig economics that never shows up in a simple day rate spreadsheet, the small, ever-present probability of a single event erasing everything. Here's a distinction that reshapes how you should think about who actually gets hurt when oil prices crash. Often, the owner of the rig is not the same economic actor as the company selling the oil. The rig business typically earns a service fee, a day rate, while the exploration company takes on the actual commodity price risk. That separation matters enormously because it changes exactly who suffers when oil prices fall. A rig owner isn't necessarily betting on oil prices directly. They're betting on whether exploration companies will keep hiring rigs at all, which is a related but genuinely different risk than betting on the oil price itself. We touched on geopolitics earlier. Now here's where it becomes almost absolute. National oil companies, state-backed entities, can change the entire game overnight. A state-backed buyer can support long-term offshore drilling activity even when private capital is pulling back entirely, because their decisions are shaped by strategic energy policy and national interest, not purely market efficiency or short-term profitability. Which means rig demand isn't just shaped by economics. It's shaped by which governments have decided that energy independence or energy leverage over other nations is worth funding regardless of the market cycle. In a world of sanctions, energy security concerns, and supply shocks, offshore drilling capacity becomes something closer to a strategic geopolitical asset than a purely industrial one. Owning rig capacity can function almost like owning an option on future energy demand and energy sovereignty, not just a bet on drilling economics. Here's a structural risk that catches owners who think ownership alone guarantees control. A rig is only one piece of a much larger operating system. Support vessels, subsea equipment, specialist crews, logistics networks, port access, and maintenance supply chains all directly influence whether a rig is actually profitable. Owning the rig without controlling, or at least securing reliable access to, this surrounding ecosystem can leave an owner completely exposed to bottlenecks and unexpected cost overruns, even when the rig itself is in perfect working order. It's a reminder that isolated ownership of a single expensive asset means very little if you don't control or can't reliably access everything that asset depends on to actually function. Here's the final risk layer, and it's the one that quietly kills more rig companies than bad geology or bad luck ever does: financing. A well-leveraged, meaning heavily indebted, rig company can be destroyed by debt service payments even if the underlying asset is technically sound and fully contracted. This is exactly why offshore drilling bankruptcies are often as much a capital structure story as an energy story. The rig can be working perfectly, the day rate can be solid, and the company can still collapse simply because it borrowed too aggressively to build or acquire the asset in the first place. Just like we saw with airlines and casinos on this channel, the physical business can be sound while the financial structure underneath it quietly fails. So after all of this, the idle cost risk, the catastrophic tail risk, the debt exposure, the geopolitical exposure, why does anyone still want to own offshore drilling capacity? Because the market often isn't paying for current certainty. It's paying for optionality. Offshore rigs are valuable precisely because they can be deployed the moment the cycle turns favorable and scrapped or stacked when it doesn't. Investors in this space are frequently paying less for today's cash flow and more for the right to participate in the next upcycle whenever it eventually arrives. Owning a rig in this light is less like owning a factory and more like holding a long-dated option on the future of global energy demand, an option that happens to cost an enormous amount of money to simply keep alive while you wait. So let's return to where we started. A machine that costs money every second, whether it drills or not. An asset whose real value is a contract, not the steel itself. A business where geopolitics, national governments, and global sanctions can rewrite your entire financial future overnight. The oil rig business looks simple from a distance. Buy steel, drill wells, collect checks. In reality, it's a leveraged bet on the world's appetite for energy, the stability of global geopolitics, and your ability to survive the ugly parts of the cycle long enough to reach the next upturn. This is exactly the kind of industry this channel exists to take apart, the ones that look like simple machinery from the outside and turn out to be geopolitics, capital structure, and risk, wearing an industrial disguise. If this changed how you see the next headline about oil prices or offshore drilling, subscribe, because we're just getting started pulling apart the businesses hiding behind